Just past 2 o'clock, a minibus pulled up to the White House. The doors hissed open, and a group of children spilled out, their voices rising in a chorus of excitement as they followed their guides toward the hallowed halls. Standing apart from the crowd, Fleming kept his gaze locked on Simon. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a low, sharp whisper. "Simon, listen. Merge with the group. Find someone to talk to. Act like any other child, and do not acknowledge me. My agent is the blonde woman leading the group. If you detect anything critical, signal her with absolute discretion. I will be watching." Simon nodded once, his expression unreadable. He stepped forward, his small frame shifting into the rhythm of the other children. Within seconds, he was indistinguishable from the rest, a shadow moving among the crowd. Fleming stepped back, allowing the distance to grow. He watched the group disappear into the stone architecture. The group moved through the historic hallways, their footsteps muffled by thick carpets. Every wall held portraits that seemed to watch their progress. Finally, they reached the threshold of the Oval Office. The guide lowered her voice to a reverent whisper, explaining the significance of the room. Suddenly, 2 agents materialized on either side of the door. They stood motionless, their eyes scanning the corridor. One spoke into a concealed microphone. The air in the room grew heavy with anticipation. The guide signaled for the children to step back, creating a clear space. A moment later, the president emerged. He stopped, his gaze sweeping over the group with a practiced, warm smile. He spoke of the future and the weight of the nation, his voice steady and rhythmic. While the other children leaned forward, wide-eyed and mesmerized, Simon remained perfectly still. He did not look at the office or the staff. His eyes were locked on the president, tracking every micro-expression and shift in posture. He was not listening to the words. He was dissecting the man. To the rest of the room, he was just another child, but his focus was a blade. As the president finished his remarks and turned to leave, Simon's jaw tightened. The tour concluded with a final brisk walk back to the waiting minibus. One by one, the children climbed aboard, their voices still buzzing with excitement about the day. A guide stood at the door, clicking a counter for every head that passed. Simon moved with the flow, his face a mask of calculated indifference. As the bus pulled away from the White House, he leaned his head against the glass, watching the city blur into a gray smear. The other children shared stories, but Simon remained silent, his gaze fixed on the horizon. His stop was the last one, a deliberate choice to ensure no one was watching. When the bus finally rolled into the empty parking lot, Fleming was already there, leaning against his sedan. Simon stepped off, the door hissed shut, and he walked straight to the car. The ride to FBI headquarters was devoid of conversation. Fleming kept his eyes on the road, his knuckles white against the steering wheel. Beside him, Simon sat with his hands clasped tightly, his small frame seemingly shrinking under the pressure of what he had witnessed. The city lights flickered past, casting long, shifting shadows. They pulled into the secure garage, the heavy steel door grinding shut behind them, sealing them away from the world. Inside the office, the air felt thin. Simon moved to a side room, shed his layers, and returned to face the 2 men. Fleming leaned forward, his hands flat on the desk. He looked at the boy. "Simon, tell us, how bad is it?" Simon did not hesitate. His voice was steady, cutting through the silence of the room. "The infiltration is deep. It is total." Tanner gripped the armrests of his chair. "Who is involved?" Simon listed the names, his tone clinical. 9 people. The Secretary of State, the Chief of Staff, the Secretary of Defense, the Personal Secretary, the 2 bodyguards, the Attorney General, and the head of the Secret Service. He paused, letting the weight of the list settle. "And the President." Fleming stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "That is impossible." "How?" Simon explained the process. "They are twins. They replaced the originals at 18. They are brilliant, charismatic, and entirely loyal to the Kremlin." Walker steered the car into the flow of city traffic, her eyes locked on the rearview mirror. She saw them immediately. 3 dark sedans, maintaining a precise distance, matching every turn and lane change. Within seconds, 3 additional FBI vehicles peeled off from side streets, flanking the convoy in a tight, protective wedge. The pursuers realized they were compromised. The lead car accelerated, swerved through a red light, and vanished into an alley. The other 2 followed suit, scattering in opposite directions with calculated efficiency. Walker pulled her vehicle to the curb, the tires screeching. The threat had evaporated, but the message was clear. They were being watched. "Stay sharp," Walker muttered, her hand resting near her side. The agents in the trailing cars pulled up, their faces grim. They had seen the same maneuver. There were no coincidences in this operation. Walker shifted gears and pushed back into the lane, her grip on the wheel iron tight. She radioed ahead. "Increase the perimeter. We have been tracked." The hotel parking lot was a fortress. 8 agents stood in a perimeter, weapons ready. As Walker pulled into the designated zone, they moved in a tight protective cluster, shielding Simon from the lobby entrance to the elevator. The doors slid shut, sealing them away. When the suite door opened, the atmosphere shifted instantly. Sarah stood in the hallway, her hands trembling until she saw him. She pulled him into a desperate embrace, her relief palpable. Eric and Lily crowded around, their voices overlapping in a rush of questions. The grandparents stood back, watching the scene with quiet concern. The agents did not linger, retreating to their posts outside the room. Inside, the heavy burden of the day seemed to lift, if only for a moment. Simon looked at his mother, his shoulders finally dropping. The exhaustion hit him all at once, pulling at his eyes. He walked toward the dining table, where plates were already set. He grabbed a burger, his movements quick and ravenous. For these few minutes, he was just a boy, hungry and tired. The ring of the telephone cut through the quiet of the suite like a blade. Sarah answered, her voice soft, but her expression hardened as Fleming spoke on the other end. She looked at Simon, who was still focused on his meal, his movements mechanical and weary. "He is exhausted, Mr. Fleming," she said, her voice tight with a mother's frustration. "He is finally eating. Can he not rest for a few hours?" The reply from the other end was cold, precise, and final. 30 minutes. That was all the time the nation could afford him. She hung up the phone, the silence that followed heavier than before. She walked to the dining room, her heart sinking as she watched him. "Simon," she whispered, and the boy looked up, his eyes already shifting from the plate to the door. He did not ask why. He did not complain. He simply stood, wiping his hands, the hunger forgotten as the weight of his purpose returned to his small frame. Walker was already waiting in the hallway, his presence a grim reminder. Sarah pulled Simon into one last, desperate embrace, feeling the fragility of his body against her own. She knew, with a sudden, sharp clarity, that the boy she held was no longer just hers. He belonged to the shadows, to the secrets, and to a duty that would never let him go. She watched him walk toward the door, his steps steady and devoid of hesitation. As the suite door clicked shut, she stood in the center of the room, listening to the fading echo of his footsteps, knowing that his childhood had been sacrificed to the altar of national survival. The silence did not arrive gradually. It fell across the country like a physical weight, pinning the nation to the earth. In the heart of the capital, traffic lights cycled through their patterns for empty intersections. In the industrial hubs, assembly lines ground to a halt, the hum of machinery replaced by a hollow, ringing stillness. Every city, every town, every isolated farmhouse felt the same sudden contraction of life. People stopped where they stood. The morning commute turned into a frozen tableau of faces turned toward screens or radios, eyes fixed on nothing. There was no movement in the streets, only the sound of a collective gasp that seemed to vibrate through the very pavement. Tears were not a choice. They were a common reaction to the news that had stripped away the normalcy of the day. The pulse of the nation had slowed to a crawl, and for this singular, suspended moment, the only thing that existed was the heavy, suffocating reality. The initial paralysis eventually gave way to a persistent, hollow ache. In the quiet corners of America, the shock had settled into a permanent fixture of daily life. Curtains remained drawn against the afternoon sun, casting long gray shadows across living rooms, where the silence was broken only by the rhythmic, muffled sound of weeping. People moved through their homes like ghosts, avoiding the mirrors and the screens that still carried the images of the tragedy. In kitchens, coffee turned cold in mugs that no one reached for. In bedrooms, the sound of a stifled sob would drift through thin walls, a reminder that the grief had not dissipated. It had simply moved indoors. It was a private, quiet misery that clung to the edges of every community. Neighbors passed one another on sidewalks without making eye contact, their heads bowed, shoulders hunched against a wind that did not exist. The collective gasp had become a shallow, labored breath that defined the rhythm of every hour. There was no recovery, only the slow, agonizing process of existing within the shadow of what had been lost. Every town, from the industrial outskirts to the quietest suburbs, remained tethered to this somber reality, trapped in a cycle of mourning that refused to break. While the nation remained locked in the grip of its collective mourning, a different reality was taking shape behind reinforced glass and heavy steel doors. In the heart of the intelligence complex, the atmosphere was not one of loss, but of sharp, clinical precision. The lights here did not dim. They hummed with a steady, electric intensity that illuminated stacks of files and glowing monitors. Here, the sorrow of the streets was a distant, irrelevant frequency. The work of the intelligence community had reached a critical inflection point. Where the public saw only the void left by tragedy, those in the inner sanctum saw the successful execution of a long-term strategy. The air in the command center was cool and smelled of ozone and filtered dust. Technicians moved with a rhythmic, focused efficiency, their eyes tracking data streams that signaled the end of a major threat. It was a morning of quiet, calculated triumph. The machinery of the state had functioned exactly as intended, and the results were now being processed in real time. Fleming stood before the main console, his fingers hovering over the glass as the final confirmation scrolled across the screen. Beside him, Tanner leaned in, his weight shifting slightly as he scanned the data. The Rasputin file was closed. The objective, once a chaotic variable, had been reduced to a simple, binary state of completion. Fleming tapped a key, and the screen flickered, archiving the mission logs into the permanent record. He turned his head, catching Tanner's gaze. There was no celebration, no sudden release of tension. Instead, a slow, deliberate nod passed between them. It was the recognition of a machine functioning perfectly. Tanner reached out and adjusted a dial on the console, his movements steady, his focus absolute. They had calculated every contingency. The room remained silent, save for the low, rhythmic drone of the cooling fans. Outside these walls, the world was still mourning. Fleming pulled a leather-bound ledger from the desk and made a single, sharp check mark in the margin. The ledger closed with a heavy, final thud. Fleming did not linger on the closed ledger. His eyes were already moving back to the wall of monitors, scanning the scrolling feeds that never truly stopped. Beside him, Tanner tapped a sequence into his console, pulling up a map of the city that glowed with shifting heat signatures. The Rasputin threat was neutralized, but the screen revealed a series of jagged, irregular pulses that didn't belong to the expected pattern. These were not random glitches. They were deliberate, quiet movements in the periphery of their surveillance. Fleming leaned closer, his breath hitching slightly as he traced a line of code that looped back on itself. The silence in the room changed. Tanner stood up, his chair scraping harshly against the floor, and paced the length of the command station. He stopped at the window. The shadows were not retreating. They were simply shifting shape. Every flicker on the screen was a reminder that the architecture of their control was porous. They began to recalibrate the sensors, their movements faster now, driven by the cold realization that something else was watching from the dark. The air inside Jacob Hirsch's home hung heavy and still, undisturbed by the world outside. Dust motes drifted in the thin shafts of afternoon light that pierced the drawn curtains. Hirsch sat in the center of his study, his hands resting flat on the mahogany desk, his gaze fixed on a stack of unread files. He was motionless, a statue in the dim room. Hirsch jerked back, his chair scraping violently against the floorboards. He stared at the device as if it were a coiled snake ready to strike. The phone continued its rhythmic, piercing demand, a mechanical heartbeat in the stillness of the study. The air felt thin, difficult to draw into his lungs. He watched the cord twitch with every vibration, a coiled wire tethering him to an unknown source. He reached out, his fingers brushing the cold surface of the receiver. His skin felt clammy, a stark contrast to the sharp, biting chill that seemed to radiate from the device itself. Then, a voice emerged, low, steady, and entirely devoid of warmth. It did not offer a name. It did not offer a greeting. It simply spoke a series of coordinates, followed by a date. Hirsch felt the blood drain from his face, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the receiver. The weight of the information settled into his chest, heavy and suffocating. He leaned against the mahogany desk, his legs suddenly weak, a shift in the landscape that Fleming and Tanner had not yet calculated. It was a reminder that the removal of one threat was merely the clearing of a path for the next. Hirsch closed his eyes, his breathing shallow, his mind racing through the implications. The triumph of the morning had been a fragile, temporary thing. He realized now that the vigilance required was not a task to be completed, but a state of existence. He did not ask who was calling. He did not ask for clarification, leaving him in the suffocating quiet of his study once more. He lowered the receiver slowly, his hand steady now, his gaze shifting to the window.